Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, Wilder historian Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time Joseph Hooker fought his one and only major engagement as commander of the Army of the Potomac, the Battle of Chancellorsville, and was removed after the defeat. Now we move with him to the Western Theater. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. Joseph Hooker remained at Baltimore for days, but no orders were forthcoming. Meanwhile, the Army of the Potomac engaged in a bitter struggle with the Army of Northern Virginia at the little town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Frustrated, Hooker traveled to Washington, D.C. to see if he could be of any use to the War Department. Henry Halleck, the General-in-Chief, was suspicious of Hooker and ordered him arrested for entering the capital without a pass. Hooker got word to President Lincoln about the arrest, and the president must have interfered on Hooker's behalf because the general wasn't prosecuted. Lincoln didn't want to give up on Hooker. He even asked George Meade, the new commander of the army, whether he would want Hooker to be a corps commander in the Army of the Potomac. Meade took a middle road approach, but Lincoln interpreted Meade's statement as meaning he wanted Hooker to serve under him. He didn't, and told Lincoln it would be difficult for Hooker to serve under him since Hooker had been the commander of the whole army. Lincoln looked elsewhere. Missouri and Fort Monroe came up as possibilities. Hooker couldn't stand being inactive while the war continued, and he traveled to see the president regularly in order to lobby for a new appointment. He loved the Army of the Potomac, but he felt that it had early on been put in the wrong hands. He spoke about McClellan and how the army fell into evil hands, the hands of a baby who knew nothing of drill, little of organization, and nothing of its morale. It was fashioned into the congenial spirit of this man into a mass of languid inertness, destitute of either dash or cohesion. In September, a shift in the Western Theater gave Hooker the chance to take command of troops again. At the Battle of Chickamauga, the Confederate Army of Tennessee defeated the Union Army of the Cumberland, with the commander of the Union Army, William S. Rosecrans, retreating to Chattanooga, Tennessee. Now that army was trapped in the city, while the Confederate Army occupied the ridges and mountains surrounding it. To relieve Rosecrans's army, the Army of the Tennessee under Ulysses S. Grant was on its way, but it wasn't clear when the army could get to Chattanooga. It was decided to dispatch two corps from the Army of the Potomac, the 11th and 12th, to Chattanooga, with Hooker commanding both corps. Before he left Washington, Hooker visited Abraham Lincoln. They had a good meeting, with Hooker eventually getting around to criticizing his fellow commanders, particularly the ones in the West. When Hooker stood up to leave, Lincoln allegedly told him to avoid Bourbon County, Kentucky on the way there. By the first week in October, Hooker was in Stevenson, Alabama. Rosecrans ordered him to guard the railroad from Nashville to that location in order to preserve the supply line of the Army of the Cumberland, especially since Confederate cavalry prowled Tennessee trying to cut off all the supplies going into Chattanooga. While helping to establish a solid supply line to Rosecrans, Hooker attempted to rid himself of a personal enemy in Henry Slocum. Slocum commanded the 12th Corps and had served under Hooker in the East. The personal animosity didn't go away when they were both transferred west, and Hooker suggested to the War Department that it may be wise for Slocum to be sent to Missouri. Slocum was no fan of Hooker either. They would have to remain with one another for the moment, though. The Lincoln administration believed that Rosecrans would retreat from Chattanooga, and that definitely was on Rosecrans's mind, but Old Rosie was also making preparations to open up what would become known as the Cracker Line, and nearly had the plan developed and ready to be executed. However, the War Department feared the general would retreat. They named Ulysses S. Grant to command the military division that went from the Appalachian Mountains to the Mississippi River. The victor of Fort Donelson, Shiloh, and Vicksburg heard the War Department's fears about Rosecrans, and through the consent of the department, notified Rosecrans that George Thomas, the Rock of Chickamauga, would supersede him. Grant then traveled from Louisville into Tennessee and into northern Alabama. Hooker heard about the general coming, and instead of going himself to the railroad depot to meet Grant, Hooker sent a staff officer to go pick up Grant and take him to Hooker's headquarters. When the staff officer showed up, Grant was offended that Hooker broke with military etiquette by not coming himself. He told the staffer, "If General Hooker wishes to see me, he will find me on this train." Hooker visited Grant at the train, meeting there for a while before Grant, along with Oliver Otis Howard, commander of the 11th Corps, moved on toward Chattanooga. Thomas informed Hooker of his next mission, to maneuver into Lookout Valley to secure the line of communication and supplies running from Chattanooga to Stevenson, Alabama. Hooker feared that an enemy force could sweep down from Lookout Mountain and destroy him, but Thomas wasn't deterred. The orders remained the same. Thomas also removed Slocum out from under Hooker's control, which delighted Hooker. When Hooker made it into Lookout Valley and to Brown's Ferry, part of his command was separated from the other, with a large portion near the ferry and a division at Wauhatchie. That night, Confederate forces made a night attack on those spread-out units. Through mismanagement by the Confederates, Hooker's troops were able to throw back the attacks. As more and more troops came into Chattanooga, Hooker felt his opportunity to be at the forefront slipping, especially since Grant didn't care for him. The 11th Corps was ordered to help the newly arrived William T. Sherman to try to dislodge the Confederates from Missionary Ridge, leaving Hooker with a single division, John W. Geary's division of the 12th Corps. However, this wouldn't be Hooker's fate for long. He was given command of 2 other divisions, all belonging to different armies. Charles Cruft's division of the Army of the Cumberland and Peter Osterhaus's division from the Army of the Tennessee would join Hooker. Hooker was ordered to make a demonstration against Lookout Mountain and to attack if the opportunity arose. Hooker wasn't one to back down from launching an attack if possible, so on November 24th, he prepared his divisions to attack the lofty heights of Lookout Mountain. His troops marched up the steep sides of the mountain and then began to attack the Confederates in their entrenchments and rifle pits while heavy fog clung to the side of the heights. At a plateau where a home known as the Craven's House stood, the majority of the fight took place. Once that location was captured, Hooker had his men halt and he trudged up the steep slope to inspect the fortifications. He wired back to Thomas that the position was impregnable. One of Hooker's biographers explained the significance of Hooker's actions. The positive gains of the battle were important. Navigation of the river and control of the railway to Chattanooga were assured. Much equipment was captured. The enemy's defenses across Chattanooga Valley were flanked, and the morale of the army was given a big boost. A soldier on Orchard Knob, watching the advance on Lookout Mountain through an occasional break in the weather, had remarked, "Look at old Hooker. Don't he fight for keeps?" The next day, Hooker attacked the Confederate left flank on Missionary Ridge and helped push the Confederate Army of Tennessee off the ridge and send them into full retreat. Hooker asked for permission from Thomas to continue the pursuit, and Thomas granted it, adding more troops to Hooker's column. Hooker chased them to Ringgold, Georgia, where Confederate Major General Patrick Cleburne was making a stand to protect the Confederate wagon train. Hooker attacked Ringgold Gap, but he faced harsher resistance than he did at Lookout Mountain. The bloody battle ended when Grant came on the scene and told Hooker to discontinue the attack. He would allow Hooker to advance as long as he didn't engage with the enemy. Hooker would say, "This puts me in the condition of the boy who was permitted to learn to swim, provided he would not go near the water." Hooker remained near Ringgold for a while before going into winter quarters at Chattanooga. His headquarters was on a hillside near the river, and his bodyguard and staff formed teams and played baseball on good weather days. Hooker, although he played the sport in his youth, didn't participate in these games. He continued to write to Washington, though, touting his own contributions to the opening of the Cracker Line and his battle above the clouds on Lookout Mountain. Grant still didn't care for Hooker, despite his good service so far under his command. Grant didn't care for his ambition because he saw it as reckless rather than an advantage. Grant soon left the Army of the Tennessee and was made commander of all Federal armies, with his headquarters in the field with the Army of the Potomac. Hooker had hoped to possibly be sent back east, especially when George Meade began to take criticism for his lack of movement following the Battle of Gettysburg, but with Grant with the army, it would never come to pass. The Army of the Cumberland around Chattanooga was reorganized, with the 11th Corps commander, Oliver Otis Howard, being placed in charge of the 4th Corps, and the 2 corps under Hooker, the 11th and 12th, being consolidated into one corps, named the 20th Corps. The spring campaign was going to be against the Army of Tennessee, but it would have a new commander, Joseph E. Johnston. Hooker had been friends with him in the old army and entered Chapultepec together during the Mexican War. He wrote that Johnston was going to be a more capable commander than Braxton Bragg. Hooker thought highly of Johnston's war record and knew that the next few months would be a struggle to wrestle Atlanta from his old friend. In early May, the Atlanta campaign began, with Hooker now formally part of the Army of the Cumberland under Thomas. Thomas liked Hooker and used him to hold the Confederates in place north of Dalton, while the Army of the Tennessee attempted to get behind the rebels and cut them off from Atlanta. Johnston pulled his army back to Resaca, and Sherman concentrated his forces there. Hooker's corps was on the Union left flank and prepared to launch an attack. Sherman, Thomas, John Schofield, the 23rd Corps commander, and Hooker all went to a bald hill to observe the Confederate position. When a rebel artillery battery began to shell the hill, Thomas and Schofield went to the rear. Sherman and Hooker remained. Neither one liked the other, and neither one wanted to show fear in the presence of the other. They mingled around, not saying a word to one another, until, as one historian explained, finally, by some mysterious impulse, certainly not by any oral agreement, they simultaneously marched the rear. This schoolboy performance was quite humorous to their associates, but the bitter gulf between Sherman and Hooker made it deadly serious to them. Johnston again retreated. From Resaca, he went to Cassville, then blocked Sherman's advance to the west at New Hope Church, Dallas, and Pickett's Mill. Hooker's corps hit Johnston's line first at New Hope Church, but the Confederates wouldn't budge, so Hooker's men held the line and made demonstrations so that Thomas and James McPherson, the Army of the Tennessee's commander, made their own attacks. Johnston again retreated, this time to Kennesaw, Pine, and Lost Mountains. It was around this time that Hooker and Thomas had their only disagreement. Hooker believed that his corps was carrying the heaviest load and being stretched too thin, by sending parts of it to bolster the other corps. Thomas stood his ground and said the accusations were unjustified. Hooker backed down. That was the only altercation the two men had. Hooker would declare after the war that Thomas was by far the Union's most outstanding leader. At Kennesaw Mountain, part of Hooker's corps was attacked by Confederates at Kolb's Farm. When Sherman asked him about his progress, Hooker signaled back, "We have repulsed 2 heavy attacks and feel confident, our only apprehension being from our extreme right flank. 3 entire corps are in front of us." Sherman would use the message to further criticize Hooker. Sherman accused him of not following military protocol by not directing his message through Thomas, even though Sherman was the one who asked him a direct question. Sherman also thought it slanderous to say that he had apprehensions about his extreme right flank, which was guarded by Schofield. However, only Sherman seemed to be angry about the statement. Schofield was not bothered by it. Thirdly, Hooker said he had 3 corps in front of him, which was weird for him to say, as Sherman pointed out, because Johnston only had 3 corps in his whole army. Sherman didn't like the exaggeration on Hooker's part, and the rift between the two grew much deeper. Making the matter worse, Sherman went to visit Hooker, and in an old church lectured him about sending false dispatches. At the brutal Battle of Kennesaw Mountain, Hooker's force had only a supporting role in the attacks. Johnston continued to retreat, this time across the Chattahoochee River. And Sherman pursued. It came to be known through the army that now Johnston had been replaced with John Bell Hood, one of his corps commanders. The next phase of the campaign would be much bloodier, with the hard-fighting Hood in charge of the army. The Army of the Cumberland came to and crossed Peachtree Creek, north of Atlanta. Along its banks on July 20th, 1864, Hood's first battle as commander of the Army of the Tennessee took place. Hooker's corps absorbed some of the deadliest attacks launched by the Confederates, but they and the rest of the army held on, throwing back the rebels. After the attack, Thomas and Sherman came to Hooker's headquarters. Hooker expressed to the two generals that his men were wore out and suffered heavy losses in the battle along Peachtree Creek. To that point, Hooker's corps had suffered more casualties than any of the other corps of Sherman's army group. In reference to the heavy losses, Sherman responded, "Oh, most of them will come back in a day or two," insinuating that they simply deserted. One staff officer, hearing Sherman's words, demanded a pistol to shoot Sherman for disrespecting such brave men. 2 days after Peachtree Creek, the Battle of Atlanta erupted, but Hooker's men took no part in the battle. However, a death during the battle impacted Hooker greatly. James McPherson, the commander of the Army of the Tennessee, was killed. Temporarily, John A. Logan, the 15th Corps commander, took command, but Sherman needed a permanent successor. Sherman decided against choosing Logan, somewhat based on him not having a military education. Hooker was the highest-ranking corps commander in either of the 3 armies in Sherman's army group, and expected to be placed as that army's commander. When Sherman chose Oliver Otis Howard, that was the last straw for Hooker, who couldn't take any more of Sherman's insults. He wrote out a resignation letter to Thomas, saying, "I have just learned that Major General Howard, my junior, has been assigned to the command of the Army of the Tennessee. If this is the case, I request that I may be relieved from duty with this army. Justice and self-respect alike require my removal from an army in which rank and service are ignored." Hooker reached out to Logan and told him that had Logan remained in command of the army, he himself would have stayed with the Army of the Cumberland. But when a general from another army was placed in command of the Army of the Tennessee, he couldn't bear the injustice. Perhaps he hoped that Logan may resign in protest with him, but Logan's future political aspirations wouldn't let him leave the army. Hooker left the army, and his men hated to see him go. After coming west, Hooker demonstrated his ability as a commander, but his mouth got in his own way. A member of his corps wrote, "What the 20th Corps has accomplished under Hooker's command and how much the success of the campaign is due to him, the public will never learn from Western correspondence or official dispatches. No general was more careful of the comfort and welfare of his men. When other corps were hungry, we always had rations. When other corps were ragged, we had clothes." He waited for 2 months for a command to come available. He visited Niagara Falls and visited family in Watertown. He delivered a speech saying, "This Union, gentlemen, cannot be dissolved as long as the army have guns to fight with. I believe in treating the rebellion as General Jackson treated Indians. Whip them first and treat with them afterwards." On September 28, 1864, he was given command of the Northern Department, encompassing Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois. He was responsible for taking care of prisoners in the prisoner of war camps located in those states, to guard the northern border from arms and ammunition coming south, and enforce the draft. Hooker got all kinds of reports, but referred to most of it as stuff or of little credence. His biggest problem was with guerrillas raiding across the Ohio River, but he bolstered the units in those areas to deal with the irregulars. Hooker also moved the department headquarters from Columbus, Ohio to Cincinnati, Ohio, a better location for dealing with the duties of the department. However, there was another reason Hooker moved his headquarters. Miss Olivia Grosbeck lived there. At age 50, Hooker took up a serious courtship with the young woman, 11 years his junior. When reports about possible sabotage missions coming from Canada found their way to Hooker's desk, he put little faith in the reports, although he did make a statement. "If anything of this sort is attempted, I intend that somebody shall be hurt before it is over, if I have to go into Canada to do it. If the Canadian authorities allow our enemies to enter the territory to organize for hostile purposes, I shall exercise the same right, and if exception is taken, it can be arranged afterward by negotiation." When Hooker heard about the advancement of Sherman, Philip Sheridan, and Meade to major generals in the regular army, Hooker responded, "Would it not be far better to put military commissions in the market and dispose of them at public auction as any other commodity?" He then accused Sherman of having no more judgment than a child. "A studied effort has been made by Generals Grant and Sherman to keep me in the background. It would have given me the greatest satisfaction to have broken my saber over the head of Sherman." When Lincoln won election in the fall of 1864, Hooker stated that it was the greatest victory of the war, and attended the inaugural ball in March 1865. After that, he remained in Washington and testified before the Committee on the Conduct of the War. At its conclusion, and in its report, it declared that Hooker was blameless for the defeat at Chancellorsville. Hooker had been fighting for this for a long time, and now he had it in writing that he wasn't to blame for the defeat. A little over a month into Lincoln's second term, he was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. Lincoln had been a staunch supporter of Hooker, so the general took the president's death hard. Since he was to be laid to rest in Springfield, Illinois, it was in his department, and he escorted the body from when it entered the department until it reached Springfield. There he took part in the funeral procession, and at the grave he sat stiff in his saddle as the preacher spoke over the body of the slain president. At the end of May, Hooker returned to California to accept the sword that the legislature of the state commissioned for him over 2 years before. With over 400 diamonds, various inscriptions, and gold throughout, it was a stunning sword. At the end of June, Hooker presided over a meeting where 10,000 people came to hear Grant speak. Hooker and Grant's first time speaking since Chattanooga was uneventful. In July, he went east to take command of the Department of the East, encompassing New England, New York, and New Jersey, which was within the military division of the Atlantic, commanded by George Meade. In September, he returned to Cincinnati, and in October, he and Olivia were married. The next month, at a reception for General Grant in New York City, Hooker suffered a stroke, losing nearly all use of his right side. Nevertheless, he stayed with his command, and by the summer of 1866 he had nearly completely recovered. But Olivia began to suffer illness. He was transferred to the Department of the Great Lakes, with his headquarters in Detroit, Michigan. In early 1867, he suffered another stroke and had to take leave of absence. He and Olivia traveled to Europe, hoping both of them could recover there. They returned in July 1868, and shortly thereafter, Olivia passed away. 3 months later, Hooker retired from the Army. Hooker spent his retirement years attending the reunions of the various groups he was affiliated with, like the Grand Army of the Republic, the Army of the Cumberland, and the Army of the Potomac. He continued to insult Grant, Sherman, and Howard in speeches and letters. One of the only men to get his praise was Thomas. He preached reconciliation after the war and welcomed Southerners into his home, including the hard-fighting Confederate General John B. Gordon. He commissioned a huge painting of himself at the Battle of Lookout Mountain, and it was put on exhibition in a New York gallery in 1874. Although physically handicapped, Hooker traveled across the country to California. He wanted to see his old property again. When he arrived, various groups came together to throw him a huge reception. He made it back home in time to cast his ballot in the presidential election of 1872 against Grant and for Horace Greeley. Hooker even predicted that Grant would suffer a great defeat, but he was wrong. Although Hooker linked up with the radical Republicans in the Committee on the Conduct of the War, he soon went back to his old political party, saying, "I never was anything else than a Democrat." On October 31st, 1879, Hooker wrote a letter about a statue of George Thomas to be erected in Washington, D.C. It said, "I assure you it is the only equestrian statue in Washington that will be likely to receive the admiration of all who gaze upon it, and in my judgment the representative of the most gifted soldier this country ever produced, and the best man in all respects it has ever been my fortune to know." At the conclusion of this letter, Hooker passed away at his home in Garden City, New York. The body laid in state in the City Hall in New York City, with a massive crowd to come see the general. The pallbearers, which included Generals Daniel Butterfield, Winfield Scott Hancock, and Abner Doubleday, escorted the body to a special train destined for Cincinnati. Once there, the body was taken to Spring Grove Cemetery to be laid next to his wife. On the journey to the cemetery, old soldiers followed, accompanied by a riderless horse, and veterans carrying torn and tattered battle flags. At sundown, he was laid to rest. Abraham Lincoln pointed out the biggest downfall of Joseph Hooker when he composed a letter explaining his reasons for placing Hooker as the commander of the Army of the Potomac. Hooker criticized his superiors to anyone who would lend him an ear. This backbiting that Lincoln identified kept Hooker on the bad side of many influential commanders like Sherman and Grant later in the war. Hooker also made friends with influential politicians, which helped his star rise in the Union Army. Despite his bad qualities of openly criticizing superiors and other generals, Hooker was a capable division and corps commander. His men loved him, and he performed good service on the Peninsula and at Second Manassas. At Antietam, his brigades went in piecemeal, but he wasn't present during the entire engagement, being wounded in the foot. At Fredericksburg, his command was dismantled, being sent to other commanders for their use, so his performance there was lackluster at no fault of his own. When he finally took command of the Army of the Potomac, Hooker finally reached what he had been searching for, but the Battle of Chancellorsville demonstrated some holes in his confident armor. He wasn't as confident when it was him alone who commanded the army, and didn't have anyone else to blame. When Robert E. Lee invaded Pennsylvania, Hooker had trouble getting correct information on the enemy, and with what information he did have, he attempted to halt the advance as much as possible, but his suggestions to the General-in-Chief Henry Halleck were countermanded and subverted. This led him to resign as the Army commander. When Hooker went west, his performance was commendable. He captured Lookout Mountain and helped dislodge the Confederates from Missionary Ridge. The Battle of Waxahachie could have been a disaster for Hooker because of the spread-out nature of his force, and his men succeeded in throwing back the rebels, but Hooker didn't play a significant role in their success. At Ringgold Gap, Hooker suffered his worst defeat since Chancellorsville, and his tactical ability in that battle was suspect. Perhaps he thought he could dislodge the rebels like he and the others did at Missionary Ridge. What he didn't know was that he faced one of the most capable commanders in any Confederate army, Patrick Cleburne. On the Atlanta campaign, Hooker worked incredibly hard to keep his men supplied and ready for combat, and his casualties bear out that the Corps was one of the hardest fighting, if not the hardest fighting corps in all of Sherman's army group. For a man whose life was at the forefront of newspapers and in the public mind, it's strange when one reads about his later life and learns how muted those years were. The strokes he suffered limited his ability somewhat, even though he strove to regain his full capabilities. Although at reunions and to others he still criticized certain commanders of the war, he never received the same post-war attention that others received for their rhetoric and publishings. Joseph Hooker will go down in history as a man with uncontrolled ambition, and that led him to criticize the wrong people. He will be known as the man who, when confronted by an enemy that he boasted he would best, recoiled at some of the least bit of resistance. This lack of confidence manifested itself at Chancellorsville, but didn't seem to appear in other areas of the war. He remained confident elsewhere in any other campaign. Hooker will also go down in history, wrongly so, for being the reason that prostitutes are called hookers. That name was in existence before Hooker himself rose to prominence, but it may be said that the name Hooker was reinforced by the camp followers around his units, whether divisions, corps, or Army of the Potomac. That, unfortunately, may be his longest-lasting legacy, even though it was a myth. Hooker put on an outward appearance of confidence, which he displayed to the world, but the Battle of Chancellorsville unveiled to himself and the world that the confidence he displayed was a mask. He wasn't always confident in his abilities, despite all of his boasts.